Hey, so I wanted to talk to you about texturing today. Usually when I teach about texturing, it's after a long course where we've already done modeling and a bunch of stuff, and the texturing is kind of an afterthought. So I wanted to specifically cover texturing as if you've never textured in Blender before, and we're going to take two approaches. The first one is procedural texturing techniques, and the second one is image-based or PBR texturing workflow. If you don't know what those are, that's fine. I'm going to try to talk about how I like to marry those two techniques together for a really efficient, fast workflow, which can help you create props very quickly and environments. This is obviously being done within Blender. Some of the principles we talk about can be used elsewhere. The workflow is very similar. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started with those two things. Now, this is a scene I've just been working on. I've put maybe an hour into this so far. I'm creating some props for what will eventually be an environment for my series that I'm working on. With texturing, we have a few different approaches like I mentioned. Let's go ahead and start to set up our environment or our workspace. So we have the 3D viewport over here, this editor type. We have the shader editor, which is where you can see texture nodes, as you can see here, which we're going to do the majority of the work in the shader editor. And below that, I usually like to have my UV editor, just so I can see my UVs for any particular mesh. So yeah, that's the setup that I like just for our purposes. I'll enlarge in some of these, focus in some of these areas. But yeah, let's go ahead and start to talk about textures and materials in Blender. So when I say materials, I'm usually talking about what you see here. You can go to the material tab on any object, and we have different materials. Sometimes I use the word material and shader interchangeably. A material is kind of the overall surface of something. When I say texture, sometimes I'm talking about the images that make up that material. So in a PBR workflow, for example, a texture could be the image of wood grain that we're using to drive the base color of the wood. So just a little bit of terminology up front. To add a new material to an object, you just press this add button. And sometimes people are confused because after you press this add button, you also press this new button down here. Basically what this is, on the right side, this is just a material slot. So you can add and remove new slots. So you can press minus. But that doesn't mean there's a material assigned to that slot. And the reason for that is because in addition to adding a new material, you can go to this drop down and you can add a material that's already in the scene. So if I wanted to reuse, let's say this wood texture, now I have it twice in this material stack. But or like I said, you can press plus here to add a new slot, and you can come to new, and we can create a totally new material. Let's call this one gold, maybe. And now let's talk about how you assign materials and how you get organized. So this table in particular has 3 materials assigned to it right now. It has wood, it has this kind of rough rubber, and then it has this black metal. And the wheels also have the rubber and black metal. So I'm just reusing these all over this particular object. You can tell in edit mode what is assigned to what. So if I go to edit mode and I deselect everything with Alt A, I can choose the wood, for example, and I can say select. Now it's just selected all of the surfaces in edit mode, all of the faces that had the wood texture assigned. If I wanted to make everything that was wood gold, I can keep those selected, go over here to gold, and click assign. So now we're going to make this gold texture. We haven't changed any of the defaults, so it's just this white texture or white material. And we're going to make this into gold. So how do we start authoring our surface? How do we start assigning the attributes of this particular material? The way we do that is in 2 areas. The first area is just over here in the properties panel under the materials tab, and we get this surface tab where we can start to define some of the attributes of this particular surface. Now, real quick, the way I see this is these are just the baseline kind of generic attributes, right? When we want to start authoring procedural elements, or we want to start adding image textures to this material and the different attributes, then we're going to come over here to the shader editor, where we have a lot of the same parameters, but we can approach this in more of a logical node-based workflow where we can start to build some really cool layers and really cool effects. So just overview, the way I like to look at it is in your properties, you get very broad strokes, kind of broad attributes. And then in your shader editor, you can then start to go and create some more complex effects. So let's just look at that in practice. I'm going to turn off the viewport overlays so you can clearly see what's happening. And let's start over here in the properties editor or in the properties panel, and let's just start adding some broad stuff. So with a PBR workflow, that stands for physically based rendering. And this is a workflow where we have a series of default standardized attributes that work not just in Blender, but across other softwares as well. And these are, for the most part, shared. Sometimes there's small variations, but for the most part, when you're looking at a PBR texturing workflow, we're working with base color, metallic, roughness, index of refraction, alpha, and normal. Of course, we can break that down and get into more of these, like subsurface scattering, all kinds of stuff, transmission for glass objects, and I'm going to cover each of these as quickly as I can. So first off, base color, this is just the color. So if we're making gold, we can kind of change it to this, I'm not going super accurate, but this kind of gold color. Now, that doesn't really look like gold. One of the reasons is because this has a metallic value of 0. If we set that to 1, that's going to have the shader properties of metal, because objects in the real world are either metallic or what we call dielectric. A dielectric material, you don't even necessarily have to remember that word. That just means non-metal. So gold obviously is a metal, it's metallic, so we're going to crank that up all the way to 1. And next we have roughness. Play around with this, it's pretty self-explanatory. Lower value will be more glossy or smooth and have sharper specular reflections. A higher value will have that microscopic bumpiness or roughness, which will diffuse the light over a broader area and it'll look more rough. So we can make this pretty smooth. Obviously, this isn't like a typical table you would see, so it's kind of silly, but we'll just make that kind of a shiny gold. Next, we have IOR. This stands for Index of Refraction. Now, technically, you could look up online what is the index of refraction for gold, and it'll give you a really specific value. For the most part, the default of 1.5 honestly works for most materials. If you change this slightly, you might see a little bit of a difference. In this case, we're just going to leave it at 1.5. As you start getting into like transparent glass objects, that's where this really comes into play, if you're doing like water or glass. But in 90% of the scenarios I get into, 1.5, the default is just fine. Then we have alpha, which just makes it completely transparent. This isn't like creating a glass. This is just slowly making that material disappear until it doesn't exist. So that's obviously useful in some scenarios, and we'll get into the shader editor and kind of tweak this more specifically. But let's just keep going. Then you have normal. If you click on this, you get the option of inputting all this kind of different stuff that you could do. Just so you know, I don't typically use this menu at all. If I'm getting into this menu over in the properties editor, that's telling me this is probably something I should be doing in the shader editor over here, just because we get a visual representation of what we're doing and it's a little bit easier. So we will get into adding a normal texture, like a normal map. But just so you know, that's something we'll cover in the shader editor. All right, going down, we have a separate roughness for diffuse. That's kind of really specific if you're going for really physically accurate materials. Not something we'll cover here. Subsurface scattering. Now this one is important. If I turn this up, you'll notice it doesn't really do anything. And that's because we have this material set to be metallic, which doesn't have subsurface scattering. What is subsurface? Well, it's when light penetrates into the surface of the material. It's going subsurface. Common example of this is like wax. If you shine a light on wax, you could see it kind of has like a glow inside of it as the light penetrates into it. Another classic example is with flesh. The light penetrates into the flesh. Like if you shine a flashlight against your fingers, you can see your fingers glow red because the light is going into the surface. So we have different parameters here. We have the method of the subsurface scattering. Random walk is the default one. You can play around with Christensen-Burley or random walk skin. Not something I'll go into crazy detail on right here. We have the weight, which is kind of like the blend between subsurface scattering and not. So that just goes from 0 to 1. The radius is what we call a vector, which is always represented by this purple color. A vector is a collection of multiple numbers. So it could be 2 numbers, it could be 3 numbers. In most cases in 3D software and texturing, a vector is 3 numbers. And the reason for that is 3 numbers is just very useful. It can represent X, Y, Z, our 3 dimensions. It can represent RGB, the 3 attributes that make up all of the colors on their visual spectrum. In this case, the vector is RGB. So by default, it has a higher red value than it does green and blue. So the subsurface color is going to kind of be more red. If I made all these equal, like if all these were 1, that's going to be more neutral. It's not going to change the color from what it was. Essentially, if the first channel is higher, then the red color will penetrate deeper, the light into the subsurface. Anyway, if you ever want to reset the defaults, just hit backspace as you hover over any value in Blender, and it'll reset to the default value. Then you have the scale, which if you read the tooltip here, it says scale factor of the subsurface scattering radius. You can turn this up and the light will go even more into this. Almost looks transparent as you really bump that up. Let's turn off subsurface. Let's go on to specular. Now we have different specular distribution methods. The default of multi-scatter GGX works in 99 out of 10 scenarios. IOR level, this is your index of refraction level to decrease or increase specular intensity. 0.5 is default, and that's accurate for materials. We can cheat this because we have a license as artists to change things as we want. You could change this to 0 and you can see all the specular reflections have disappeared. If you put this at 1, they're going to be a little bit stronger. Most of the time, I'm just leaving this at 0.5, don't really need to change it. You can also mess with the tint of the specular reflections, which we're not really seeing. If I like really bumped up the IOR level, then you can start to see that red tint that we have. Again, I don't really touch this. It's not really necessary. Technically, to be physically accurate, this is always going to be just neutral white, and this will be 0.5. Okay, anisotropic, tough one to say. Turn that up. That's going to give kind of a directionality to your specular reflections. If I turn up the metallic and the roughness just a little bit, you can start to see what I'm talking about there. The specular reflections have kind of a brushed metal look to them. If I were to turn that down, you can see the difference there. We also have the anisotropic rotation as you change that. And yeah, it's kind of a directional specular reflection. Useful if you're creating things like stainless steel. If you want some very interesting smudges, you can plug a texture into the anisotropic value, which we'll get into in the shader editor. But yeah, now you know that's kind of what you do there. Okay, moving on, transmission. This is where you would make things kind of glass transmissive. Yeah, nothing to that one. Coat. This is useful for, I guess the classic example is like car paint. You have an underlying roughness value, which is a little bit more rough. And then you have a clear coat on top of that. If we crank that up, which is a separate roughness layer. So if you think about it, this is like a floor that has an underlying roughness value of like wood, for example, but maybe you went over the top of that with wax, you waxed the floor. And so then you have a thin layer of wax on top of that that's shinier or glossier than the wood underneath. Same with like a waxed car or a paint job on a car. Another example is like a TV monitor. Sometimes it has multiple layers of reflection that are transparent. So an underlying layer might be like this black, let's make this like a TV screen. So the underlying layer is a little bit more rough, but then it has a clear coat layer on top that's a little bit more glossy. So this is getting really specific, kind of a small effect here, but it can be useful in some scenarios. You also have a separate index of refraction and specular tint and a normal map for that clear coat. So now you know what the clear coat is. Let's just set that back to the default of 0 and move on. Next, we have sheen. Let me lighten this up a little bit. And I don't know if this is the best. Yeah, we'll get away with this surface. Okay, sheen is something, I like to think of it as fuzziness. So this is common in like fabrics, for example. If you take a pillow or a pair of jeans, whatever, anything that has fabric, look at it flat, kind of straight on, and then look at it at a glancing angle. So a glancing angle is you kind of put the pillow flat, so you're looking across the surface, and maybe angle it so a light is coming towards you across that surface. If you compare what it looks like flat, straight on, and at the glancing angle, because it's a fabric, it has kind of fibers, fuzziness on that fabric, and the way those fibers catch the light at that glancing angle is different from the straight on view. And that is what sheen is. Like I said, I like to think of this as fuzziness. So if I turn up the weight of this sheen, you can see this table. If I look at it at the glancing angle, it's picking up this tint color. So if I change this to red to be really obvious, you could see that red at the glancing angle. But as I look at it more straight on, more of that blue is coming through. And this is really, really great for mimicking that fuzziness in fabrics, like I said. So for example, in a pair of denim jeans, the glancing angle is going to be more of a fuzzy kind of, as you get more of the lighter fibers, and the direct angle is going to be more of the blue, the fabric that's been dyed blue. You can change the roughness of your sheen. Higher roughness will be more prominent on the tint. You can change the weight, so that's kind of the effectiveness of that. And that's sheen. So now you know it's great for fabrics. That's the main scenario where I'm going to be using this. So let's set that back to default, close that. Let's look at emission. This is when we are emitting light from an object. So we have color and we have strength. Very simple there. Obviously, as we get into the shader editor, we can start to apply different textures and get some cool effects with that. Okay, thin film. This one is really, really specific. This is for things that have a thin film layer. This is different from a clear coat layer. A thin film reacts different with the way light interacts with it. So this is common in something like oil, for example. If you look at oil that's maybe been spilled on your garage, in your garage or on your driveway, if light is hitting it, you could see it kind of has like a rainbowy, glossy reflection. Another example is if you blow bubbles, you'll notice that the bubble is very, although the bubble liquid is clear, it has this thin oily film that makes it have this colorful effect. Another one is beetle skin. If you're into bugs and you've ever noticed a beetle's skin has the same thin film effect. So this only has two things. Instead of meters, which most measurements are in Blender, this is in, I think it's nanometers. Yeah, nanometers. This is the thickness of the film. So we're talking very, very thin. When we talk about thin film, we're talking about nanometers. So if I turned this up to like 100 nanometers, we also have the index of refraction. Let me see if I can get some glossiness going on here. Let me see if I can even show you this effect. Yeah, if I turn this up to like 400 nanometers, you can kind of see, look at where the specular reflection is white, and see how as we look at it at different angles, it's changing color here. Trying to make it very apparent. Yeah, you can see that changing as I mess with the index of refraction. So again, This is kind of a specific scenario, useful for things that have a thin, oily film on top of them. I'm not using that in most cases, but there you go. Okay, that's everything we'll cover in the General Properties tab. So that's how you start to put together a surface. Now, you might have noticed there's not a lot you could do here. Like, you can set the values, you could set the colors and stuff, but there's only so far you could take this. Like, how would you make this an actual wood texture, for example? If we select what was gold and assign it to wood, a wood texture doesn't just have these straight values. It has a wood material, I should say, doesn't just have straight values. It has textures that are driving each of these attributes. So now that we know what base color is, we know what metallic, roughness, all of this stuff is, let's start to look at the actual shader editor over here. So I'm just going to join this down so we get this more clearly. And let's just delete everything in this wood texture. Let's just delete it all. And let's start to build a wood from scratch. So every new material that you create by default will have what's called a principal BSDF shader. This was developed by Disney, I think, for the movie, I could be totally wrong on this, maybe it was Wreck-It Ralph. I don't know when this came into play. But now it's something that kind of all 3D software, render engines, and game engines implement in some way. So this is the main workflow for texturing. And the reason it's so useful is because this one shader, this is what this is called, a shader, can define the properties of like 90% of materials out there. This is very useful. This one approach, this one shader, you can define everything from wood to a metal trash can to a piece of foam. There's just so much you could do within this. So we're looking at the same properties, base color, metallic roughness. We have all of these tabs that we had over here, but the difference with this is more of a node-based approach. So when you think about nodes, I like to think about it as little stations in an assembly line or in a factory. So we have one station that does a specific job. So if the factory was producing cereals, then one station is just putting the cereal into a box and closing the box, okay? That's just one little node on our assembly line. So in Blender, the node workflow goes from left to right. On the far right is our material output. This is when we ship the material. This is when everything's done, everything comes together, and it gets rendered. So material output is essential. You need that for whatever you're working on. And just to show you how this works, let me add a different node. So if you can add with Shift A, just like you add anywhere else in Blender. You can also right click, or you can drag and click off of something and start to search for something. But just to add something out of nowhere, hit Shift A and let's search for RGB. This is just a simple red, green, blue values. We get a little color wheel. Let's choose kind of this teal, make it bright, and let's plug this directly into the surface material output. So now this material is just one color value. It has no specularity, no attributes of this principled shader. It is just outputting a straight color. And you can see this, it doesn't have like light or dark areas, reflections. It is just one color going into the material output. So that's the first thing. We have the surface, and if we unplug that, it's just straight black. Let's plug this back in. Next thing we have is the volume. This is different than the surface. A volume is if you were creating material for like a cloud or a foggy environment. So if I unplug surface and into the volume, if I put, I don't know, let's put a volume scatter into that. You could see instead of having a straight surface, this kind of has like a hazy, cloudy effect. And you could see that as I increase the density. Sometimes some materials are better defined by a volume, like I said, a cloud or like fog, or like a really light foam that's kind of pushing the boundary in between a solid object and something that's mostly comprised of air. So that's what the volume output is right there. We also have something called displacement and thickness, which we'll get into a little bit. But for now, I just wanted to show you this is the material output. So yes, by default, we have a principled BSDF shader that's plugged into the surface output, and that's going to make up 90% of the materials that you're going to come across. I promised I'd talk about proceduralism versus image textures. So let's first cover image textures. In 3D, I've mentioned it a few times, we have this workflow called a PBR workflow, or physically based rendering. When we're working with PBR, we're working with different texture maps that define each of these values. You can go to all kinds of resources to get PBR textures. Let me just name a few of my favorite ones, starting with just the classic, textures.com. This is subscription based. You can go download lots of physically based rendering textures. You could search for something like wood, and there you go. You're going to get a bunch of examples, and each of these, if you click on them, they have different texture maps that define each of those different attributes we went over. Albedo, which is base color, displacement, normal map, roughness, metallic, and something called ambient occlusion, which we'll cover. So there are a lot of great resources where you can download texture maps. Let me go to another one. Another really great one is called Polygon. This is run by our friend Andrew Price over at Blender Guru. And this is another one where instead of just authoring these materials procedurally, they actually go out into the real world, and in addition to kind of doing procedural textures, they scan real surfaces. So they have a whole setup where they photo scan with controlled lighting and a camera, and they capture large, high-resolution surfaces, and then they make them tileable and seamless and all the things that you need to do for 3D textures. So let's just keep with our example of wood. If you search for wood, you get a bunch of options. One of the great things about Polygon, and by the way, none of these guys are sponsors. These are recommendations I have for you. Polygon has a really great Blender add-on. If I come here, then they have this add-on where you could search directly within Blender. You can select a surface and you can apply something directly to that surface, and it'll set up all of your maps for you. So that's really nice. Yeah, there's Polygon. And then just a self plug, even though I offer it for free, if you go to RileyB3D.com, this is my site where I just give as many free zero copyright CC0 assets as I can. And here you can search for different materials. Let's keep searching for wood. And you can see I have a wood here. It's similar to textures.com where you have albedo, displacement, normal, roughness, alpha, metallic, all of the different maps. And you could download in various resolutions. So there you go. There are three. Oh, just for good measure, let's do Polyhaven. That's another good free open source one. If you go to polyhaven.com, you can come up to assets and textures, and they have a bunch of free PBR textures. So there you go. That's if you want like good photo textures that you could just download online. Yeah, and how would you set those up? Well, let's download one from my website. Let's go to RileyB3D, and let's download this wood fence texture. So generally speaking, you could download like 4K resolution. Unless you're rendering at 4K and you're going to be really close to the surface itself, doesn't really make sense to download a high resolution texture. Typically, I like to get away with the lowest resolution that I can, and I'm kind of gauging how far away my camera will be from that particular material. That's just going to save on GPU, VRAM, and render time, and all of that stuff. So go as low resolution as you can to start with. I'm just going to go 1K, and I'm just going to download these just in my downloads. There you go. So now, if I open my downloads, I have all of these maps. Well, how do we get them set up in Blender? In the shader editor, you can actually just drag and drop an image in there, and then you have these little ticks. So when I drag and drop the base color, I can drag that color tick into the base color, and now we have that particular image texture color. Now, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense for this particular table, but just roll with me, just an example. Then we have all of these options here, as quick as I can. Linear, closed, cubic, smart. This is the interpolation. What in the world does this mean? Well, by default, this has a linear interpretation or interpolation. What that means is it's kind of averaging when you get really up close and you can see the pixelation of the texture, it's averaging this out, which kind of gives a blurred effect to your pixels. If you wanted like a really crunchy pixel look to this particular texture, you could change this to closest, which you can see the difference there. Linear, closest, and then you have other options as well, cubic and smart. In most cases, I'm leaving it at linear unless I'm intentionally going for like a really low resolution texture and I'm kind of looking for like a retro pixel look, then I'll set that to closest. Projection, we'll get into this when we talk about UV mapping, but this is kind of how the texture is projected with whatever mapping approach you've taken. By default, this image is using our UVs for this particular table, and it's using a flat projection. If we were generating this texture, like with a triplanar projection, which means it's automatically projecting the texture from all three dimensions, then we might use something like box or sphere or tube. If you're using UVs, usually just leave this at flat. And then we have the extension method. This is telling us when we reach the end of a texture map, if we want to repeat it, extend, clip, or mirror. Let me see if I can give you an example of this. If I go to my shader or my UV editor, let me just scale this up. So you can see some of this surface is beyond the bounds of our UV space. So if I go back to the shader editor and instead of repeat, I change this to extend, then once we reach the end of this UV space, it's going to extend whatever pixel was on the border. We can go to clip, that'll just clip it to black, or mirror, that'll mirror whatever was there already. By default, this is repeat, which is fine. It kind of has like a tiling effect, which is what you use most of the time. Let's Control Z a little bit. And source, we have single image. You can have an image sequence. So if you have an animation on like a TV screen texture, for example, you can have an image sequence where you have a folder that has all of the frames of that animation. You can have a movie, you can generate or do UDIM tiles. That's beyond the scope of this video. For most scenarios, you're just leaving this at the default. Okay, color space. This is actually important. Color space, you have all of these options for your texture. Without going too deep into the weeds, 3D software works with something called a linear workflow. What does that mean? Well, your computer monitor displays things in 90% of cases, your computer monitor is displaying in sRGB. What am I talking about? Well, that is a section. If we look at the whole color spectrum, the visual color spectrum, your monitor can display a certain range of those colors. The problem with that is that range is extremely limiting. It's kind of just what our eyes can see. In fact, it's even less than what our eyes can see. So it's very limited. In 3D software, we can work within a linear color space, which is working with kind of a wider range of values and colors beyond what our monitor can see. And we're doing that because we have the flexibility to have more information and data to define what our texture looks like, and then it's limited and kind of funneled through the sRGB of our monitor. What in the world am I talking about? To dumb it down into the most simplified terms, most textures are defining elements within a linear workflow. And I'm talking about like metallic, roughness, normal map, okay? These are within the linear working space. When we have something like, let's just grab a normal, let's grab a roughness map. Because we're using this to define a linear value, roughness, we are going to set this to, instead of sRGB, we're going to set it to non-color. All right, these are the two ones you're going to use most frequently. I still don't feel like I'm explaining this really well, so I wanted to go back and talk about it again. If something is defining like base color, which is displayed in the scene as the final color, you want the base color on the material to look like the image that you input. In that case, you're using sRGB. If your image texture, like roughness or normal map or metallic, is used to drive a parameter in the material that's not necessarily displayed as an sRGB image. If it's more used to define the attribute, like the examples that I showed, then you're just going to set it to the non-color color space. Practically what that means, base color, set to sRGB. Emissive color, set it to sRGB. Roughness, metalness, normal, all of these things will be set to non-color data because it's taking advantage of that full linear range. Hopefully that makes sense. That's about as good as I can explain it. If you need to go look up separate videos that go more in depth on this, then I invite you to. But that's kind of practically what we're talking about. Base color, albedo, that's sRGB. Pretty much everything else is going to be set to linear. And then something like roughness, where we're accessing the linear kind of back end information of the texture, then we're using non-color. If that's confusing, let me just say base color, sRGB, metallic maps, non-color, roughness maps, non-color, normal maps, non-color. So most of the things, if it's like a black and white image or a normal map image, you can just assume it's going to be non-color data. That is about as confusing as we're going to get here, but it's important for you to know. Otherwise, you're going to have everything set to the default sRGB, and your textures in Blender aren't going to look like they're supposed to. So, all right, enough of that. So like I showed you, you could just drag in each image one at a time and set it up, or you could take advantage of a great feature in Blender, which is just select the principled BSDF and hit Control-Shift-T for texture setup. And now if I go to my downloads and I can filter by the last modified, we could turn on thumbnail previews. I could scroll down and let's just grab all of those maps from my wood texture at once. And because the way these are named on the site, I could just say principled texture setup, and it has automatically set up my base color, my metallic, roughness, alpha, displacement, and normal. And as you see, we have this interesting wood texture. We also have this little category of nodes over here called mapping. What in the world is this? Well, like I said, mapping is kind of the method for how the texture is applied to the surface. By default, it is using our UV map. And then we have this mapping node, which is defining how that is mapped onto the surface. So by default, has location and rotation of 0. If I change that, you could see the texture kind of crawls along the surface of the 3D object in the X direction, the Y direction, so we can kind of move that around, which is really handy to have access to that parameter. We can also rotate it. As you can see, I can rotate it on Z here. And if I rotate 90 degrees, it'll flip around in that direction. So we have the power to control that. And the last one is scale. The higher this value is, the more frequent it will be mapping the scale or repeating the scale. So if I change this to 2, it'll be twice as small, or 2 times more frequent. So that's backwards for a lot of beginners. They think, they think the bigger numbers should be bigger textures, but the bigger numbers are smaller, more frequent. So yeah, 2, 1, there you go. And you don't have to scale those uniformly. You could, of course, scale only on X if you wanted these to be really skinny slats all of a sudden. Okay, so that's texture mapping. And this is driving all of these image textures at one time. And the way that it's doing that, if I get rid of this, it's just going from here to each of the vector slots on these image textures. The way we can clean this up and kind of bunch all these noodles, believe it or not, they're called noodles. You could just hold down Shift and drag right click and it'll bunch all of those together. And then those are going into the various slots in our principled BSDF, with the exception of our height map or displacement map, which is going into this special node and going straight into here. In this particular material, that's not really doing much. So we're just going to get rid of it. Okay, let's talk normal map real quick. You'll also notice this one is not plugged straight into the normal. And the reason for that is a great segue into another topic, which is these little colored ticks that we have here. Why are some yellow, some gray, some kind of this bluish purple? Well, very quickly, yellow stands for color. It's a vector. Usually it's RGB, right? Our three color values. When we have this purplish blue, that's another vector, but it's not specifically color. It could be X, Y, Z. It could be RGB. Color and this purple vector are often interchangeable, but they are a little bit different, as you see with our normal map. Then we have the gray ones, which is a single color. Typically, it's a range from 0 to 1. So for a metallic map, you usually have like a black and white image. So let me just bring up a metallic map here. You can see it's black where it's dielectric or non-metal, and it's white where we have these little screws in the fence where it's supposed to turn into a metallic attribute. So yeah, if it's this grayed out tick, that means it's expecting usually like a black and white image just from 0 to 1 or from black to white. Okay, why can't we just go from normal color to normal right here? Well, we need what's called the normal map node. So if you just search for normal, you'll find normal map. And it's literally as simple as dropping this down in between to interrupt that channel. And it has a color input and a normal output. That's just one area where you're going to need, I mean, if you plug this in directly, it's just not going to look right. Just know that for normal maps, you need this node in between. And this gives you great things like controlling the strength of the normal, which is kind of the bumpiness of this surface. So that's the basics of image texturing in Blender. You can control the scale of things. You can control all the different parameters of our PBR texturing approach. And this is really great. This is really useful. But how can we push this even further? Let's come over here and let's apply just a normal wood texture. So I'm going to grab, I just have it over in this other monitor. I'm grabbing wood base color. I am grabbing wood normal. I know I'm not supposed to plug it in here. I'll change that in a second. And wood roughness. So I just have 3 maps. And this is good practice to see me set this up. Remember, if it's a black and white image, if it's working with a linear color space, you need to set it to non-color. And that goes for normal textures as well. Because I previously had these in the scene, it remembered what I had set up. And for the normal to look right, we need to drop down a normal map. So this is my wood texture. Now, what if I want to make that wood texture smaller? Just hit Control T for the texture coordinates, and we can plug these into all 3. Remember, Shift right click, you can bunch those noodles together, which is nice for keeping organized. And we can up the frequency to something like 3, so that texture is much smaller. I don't know, maybe we'll do 2. That seems pretty good. And now, what if I wanted to have every instance of this wood be slightly different? What am I talking about? Well, let me just duplicate these tables a few times, or instance them with Alt-D. Now I have all of these tables, like 12 tables. And what if I want the color of the wood or the mapping to be slightly different for each instance? Well, we could do that with a procedural approach. So remember I said marrying image-based texturing with proceduralism is a really sweet spot where you can get some really cool effects. So how do we start to introduce this procedural approach? Well, let's look at one procedural node called object data. This has data for each object instance. In particular, it has this random node here. Just to see the effects of this, let's drag random straight to the surface output, and you can see we have a random 0 to 1 value applied to each of these objects. If I were to grab these and instance these again a few times, you could see each new instance has a random value. This is really powerful. This is a great bit of information. So if I Control-Shift-Click on any node, it'll actually solo the input of that node, just for future reference. So I Control-Shift-Click the principled shader again, and it plugs that into the output. So what if I use this random value to drive some kind of other procedural effect? For example, let's drop down a mix color. So mix color is exactly what it sounds like. We're mixing from one color to another. So in this example, let's mix from green to blue, something just really ugly and obvious. If I plug this into the base color, you can see we are mixing from green to blue. A factor of 0 is green, a factor of 1 is blue, and everything in between. But what if for that factor we use our random object data? If I plug that into the factor, it's going to randomly select within the range from A to B for each instance, each object instance, which is where we can start to get some really interesting effects. Now, each object has that random factor applied to it. So let's follow the logic here. Let's plug back in our base color. Let's use this mix color, but let's use the A input as our just wood texture. And for the B input, let's have the wood texture again, but this time let's drop down a hue saturation value node. So for the B input, let's set it to a value of, well, for now, let's set it to 0 just so it's really, really clear. So factor of 0 will be the A input, the untouched image, and a factor of B will be the one that has been set to a value of 0. So it's very dark. Now let's use our random value as the factor. So each instance of the table will randomly be assigned from the untouched value to the totally darkened value of this image texture. That's a little bit strong, so let's go like 0.5, and we can even change the hue. Maybe this is very strong, so maybe like 0.47. So, oh, even that's too much. Let's do like 0.48. So every now and then a table will be a little bit more red or pink. The hue has been shifted just a little bit. And we can play with the saturation as well. Maybe have those be slightly more saturated and maybe a value of like, 0.8. So now as we step back and take a look here, you can see we have a little bit of variety within each of these wood textures. Everything is broken up a little bit. It starts to look a little bit more believable. And of course, you can further tweak these to your heart's content until you're getting the variation that you want. Now, something else that I'm noticing though is the mapping for each of these tables is exactly the same. So I'm starting to pick up a pattern. See this little light spot right here in the wood texture? As I zoom out, even with our variation, you start to pick that up on every instance of this table. So if we had a whole cafeteria full of these tables, your eye is going to pick up that pattern. It's going to break the illusion. This is going to look kind of fake. So how can we randomly play with the mapping of this as well? Well, we already have everything we need. We have our random object value. So let's duplicate this with Shift D, bring it over here. And we also have this mapping. Remember, if we change the X or the Y mapping, that's going to change how this texture is applied. What if we randomize this per instance? Well, we could just plug this straight into the location, and that's automatically going to randomize it, because this, if you think about it, is a value from 0 to 1 that's randomly assigned to each instance. And if we plug this into the location, it's going to randomly pick a value from 0 to 1 for the X, Y, and Z. So it will be up to 1 meter different on each instance. If you wanted to break it up even more, like looking at this looks fine. Obviously, honestly, this is great. If we wanted to make that range even greater, then we could use probably my most used node ever, which is called the map range node. So just search for map range and interrupt that noodle, that stream of logic. So we have another little step in our factory here. And right now this is doing nothing because it's changing. The starting point is a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. and we're going to a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 1. So what was 0 and 1 is now 0 and 1. Nothing changed. However, if we change what was from 0 to 1 and we make that 0 to, I don't know, 5, now the variable, the difference in each instance is even greater. So we went from 0 to 1 and now we're going from 0 to 5. So each of these, it's very hard to pick up a pattern because the mapping has been broken up in every single instance. So now we are starting, hopefully, to get a grasp for the power of procedural methods in tandem with image texturing workflows. Image texturing gets most of the look, gets you most of the way there, and then some procedural methods can kind of switch things up and give you some variation in your work. The really cool thing about node-based workflows is if we have a few little steps on our little factory or production line, we can take those few steps and we can bundle them into a reusable bit of logic, like a reusable bit of code, you can almost think about it, that we can use in other areas of our node graph. What am I talking about? Well, you can select any group of nodes. So let's grab these 3, for instance. Remember, these 3 are randomizing the value and the hue saturation value with each instance of our table. So we could take those 3 and we could hit Control G for group, and that creates a new group. The way we get out of that is hit Control Tab. If you want to jump back into that group, you just hit Tab. So Control Tab to go out, Tab to go down a level. And now we have this nice little group. We could even rename this. So let's name it random, oops, caps lock, random per instance, okay? Random per instance. I don't know if that's the best name, but now if we hit Shift A to add and we go to group, I've got a bunch of stuff in here just from other stuff I was doing in the scene, but now we have random per instance and we can drag that into any section of our graph. So for example, we could randomize the roughness per instance, and immediately you could see that some are a lot glossier than others. We could even jump in here and let's say right now it's dropping down to a value of 0.42 is kind of the minimum value. That's pretty glossy. So we could actually drag from this value into our node input. Actually, I did that reverse. Let's grab from our node input to the value. And now we have this value. And if we jump out, you can see that's an exposed parameter. So if I were to increase this on this one, it's not going to go quite as glossy because the minimum is not 0.42. If I set this to 0, then some instances will be perfectly glossy. It'll be completely 0, totally glossy. So that's a way to expose a parameter, but this title of value, that's not really useful. So if I go back into our node, open up the end panel, and under group, I can rename this. So it was called value. Let's call this minimum. All right. So that's the minimum value. Let's be really specific. Minimum value. So this is the lowest each of the instances will go. You could set the default value. So let's say by default it is 0.5. And if we jump back out, you could see that is now labeled minimum value, so we know what's going on. So this is really powerful. You can start to group together certain sections of your procedural logic that you're building out, and you can reuse them, give them a name, and from now on, I could be working on a completely different material. So I could be working on, let's create a new material for this little person sitting down here. We could then add group random per instance, and we're going to plug that into the, well, first let's have an RGB input. That's our teal color. All right. And now this random per instance is going to interrupt that stream of logic, And now if I were to instance our friend here a couple times, you could see, just move him here. Now we have this same logic happening for his base color. And we could have the minimum be 0, which means some of him will be very dark. We could have the minimum be 5, which is going to bring everything up to a minimum of 5, so nothing will go below that. So this becomes very powerful. We could use the same thing immediately for, let's have metallic. So by default, he is very metallic. Let's drop this down here as well. And we'll have the minimum be 0. So some instances of him are not metallic or not as metallic. And just to get lots of variety, let's instance him more times. So this little node now can be used in tandem with all kinds of stuff that we're working on when we're creating instances. And suddenly we could have one wood material and we can have it used all over our scene without it looking repetitive. We can start to break it up a little bit. Let's do something else for this guy. I'm just grabbing a random texture. This is something I have on disk. Let's plug this into base color. Ooh, he's not UV unwrapped very well. Let's do an auto unwrap on him. And I'm just gonna increase the contrast in this particular texture so we can see what's going on. So, again, we have this problem where the mapping on every instance is exactly identical. Remember, we solved that with our wood textures. Let's go back to our wood texture. And let's package this little randomized thing that we had going on here. So really, let's package all of this. Okay, so let's hit Control G. And under group input, what are the parameters that we need to change? Well, we could change the scale of the mapping. That's one thing that we would want exposed to be able to work on. And we could change the maximum map range for how much it's changing the location of the UV map per instance. So actually that one should be different. Okay, so now let's bring up the end panel and let's name those. So scale is fine. And for this one, let's call it maximum, maximum offset, because it's offsetting each instance of the UV map for the location. So now let's hit Control Tab to jump out of that group, and let's call this node group random mapping. Okay, so we have the scale just like we did before, and we have the maximum. Now, one more thing, if we jump into the group and open up the end panel again by pressing N on the keyboard, you could see that the scale is a vector value. That means it's a collection of 3 numbers. What if we always wanted the scale to be uniform? Instead of changing all 3 values, we could change this data type to a float. A float just goes from 0 to 1. So now if we jump back out, this is always a float, and the default value of this float should be 1. That's just a scale value of 1. Unchanged mapping is just repeating 1 time. So this will be 1 by default. Now, remember, this is called random mapping, and it's set up in here. We have our scale, so we could change the overall frequency or size, how much that texture repeats, and then we could change the maximum offset. So if this was set to 0, for example, each instance of this table should be exactly the same. So if we go to the top view, you could see that light area repeating on each of these wood textures. If we start to bump up that maximum offset, it is going to change each instance of this material to a different offset for that UV map, which is really, really cool. So all of that was just packaging this together. Let's go to our little person here. We could see the texture is mapping very predictably on every instance. So now with that texture that's repeating, let's just hit Shift A, let's go to group, and it was called random mapping. Now we could just plug this in here, and just like that, we have randomized the UV mapping for each instance, and we could change that maximum offset. We could change the overall mapping scale. Just really useful. So that's the end of this tutorial. We've covered so much. We covered all the basics of texturing. We covered all the basic texture or material properties. We got into a little bit of more specific PBR image-based texturing over here in the node shader editor. We got into a few procedural effects that you can do. One really useful node is the object info node, where you can go to randomize each instance of an object. Gosh, there's just so much we got into. This is maybe 2% of what Blender shader nodes can cover. I've been using Blender for 16 years now, over half my life, which is crazy to say. And one of the areas I focused in on is shading or texture authoring, specifically like props and environments is where most of my work has been. So I have a lot to share on the shader editor. This is barely scratching the surface. There are a bunch of free courses over on RileyB3D.com. You can also check out all my free videos here on the YouTube. Thanks for subscribing. You can support me over at patreon.com/RileyB3D. Hopefully you've learned something in this video. Comment if you have questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.